Like I said, we're beginning a new teaching series, and last night we had a date night here, and I don't know how many people ended up showing up. We had just over 70 that had signed up, so I think we had well into the 60s at least. We must have had 9 tables, or 8 or 9 tables that were full in here, and we had a great time, a lot of fun. If you probably don't do this right now while I'm talking, but later today, you could get on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, and if you searched hashtag LVC date night, you would get to see lots of different couples doing crazy things that they were challenged to do on their date night, and a lot of funny pictures. And then we came back here. We had just a phenomenal dessert by a caterer that goes to our church, and it was just a good dessert that we had. And then after that, we had a little discussion time. But probably the highlight, I'm sure, for everybody was a song Ryan and I sang. I think just it was so powerful, so meaningful to people's lives, and I thought, why, make it a one-hit wonder? We should share it again. Now, unfortunately, my compadre, Ryan, decided to get a cold, so I've got to do it solo. So, forgive me, but I'm going to give it a try. I'm also going to see if I can, that isn't going to work, I'm going to get a stool. Andrew is significantly smaller than me, and if I put that on, I'd look like a country western singer from the 50s up to my chest, so we'll do it this way. So here's a little song, not a little song I wrote, but here's a little song. It's simply titled, Things You Don't Say to Your Wife, and I thought maybe some of you could use this, and this will be helpful to you. I was going to name names of some people that could take notes, but I'll be kind. So here we go. Hey honey, have you gained some weight in your rear end? The dress you wear reminds me of my old girlfriend. And where'd you get the shoes? They're looking pretty lame. Would you stop talking? 'Cause I'm trying to watch the game. If you're a man who wants to live a long and happy life, these are the things you don't say to your wife. It's a quiet crowd tonight. They didn't get the sleep they wanted, nor the caffeine they needed. Maybe this will help. Is okay, but not like mother makes. The diamond in the ring I bought you is a fake. Your eyes look puffy, dear, are you feeling ill? Happy anniversary, I bought you a treadmill. If you're a man who wants to live a long and happy life, these are the things you don't say to your wife. If you're a man who doesn't want to get killed with a knife, These are the things you don't say to your wife. So like when you're with the Baptists at the buffet today and you're talking like, what'd you learn at church? Well, I learned the things I shouldn't tell my wife. Oh, good. Pass the wisdom on. We often approach marriage like that. Like, here's the things you shouldn't do or you should do. Or we read self-help books of like, here's the 3 ways to have better communication. Or here's the 5 ways to have better romance in your marriage. If we're in crisis, we tend to approach it like that. Like, here's the things we need to do. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you can tend to look at the Bible that way. Like, you start thinking like, okay, I got to find, like the 5 steps to the best marriage I could ever hope to have in the Bible. And you start reading this thing and you don't find any of those. Like, there's no self-help, no steps in this thing. It's kind of tough. In fact, if you get past that, like if you get past kind of like, well, I was looking for steps for a better relationship, maybe I'll just look for models of marriages. You ever read this thing and looked at the marriages in this thing? Like, ain't hardly any good models. Like, there might be like 4 that I could think of. Think of Abraham. Abraham is considered the father of 3 different faiths: Jewish faith, Christian faith, and Islamic faith. And here his marriage is awful. Like at points, like some points it's really good, but like at least twice he encountered 2 different kings in his married life, and he was afraid that since his wife was so beautiful, one of those kings would kill him and take his beautiful wife. And on 2 different occasions, he lied and said, "Oh, she's not my wife, she's my sister." And the king took his wife into his arms, and she came like both times this close to being put into the king's harem and being used sexually. Now, luckily, both times God put a stop to it, but that's not a model marriage. David, he writes like half of the Psalms, the hymn book of the Old Testament, and you look at his family life, and it's a mess. He ends up committing adultery with a lady, has her husband sent to the front lines in hopes that he would get killed, which he did, to cover up the affair and the pregnancy that happened because of the affair. Not a model marriage. Maybe you didn't know that, but I just let you know. That's not a model marriage. The Bible can be tough at times if you're trying to find a model marriage. Now, lest you think God covers that all up, both men paid dearly for their sins, and God obviously inspired the Bible's authors to include these stories to show us even some less than ideal matrimonial relationships, along with the consequences. Now, there's other reasons that we modern folks can get frustrated at the Bible. It doesn't have the 5 steps to this or that. It doesn't have, at times, model marriages. It's got a few, but not a ton. I think the other reasons that we get upset at the Bible is because us moderns, we come at this thing with totally different lenses than the Bible. Like, our purpose for marriage is often not the same as God's purposes for marriage. We think that marriage was primarily designed to make us happy, or to bring meaning to our lives, or to complete us in some way. Just think about it. Sometimes I think, women will spend most of their lives thinking about getting married in a white flowing dress and a knight in shining armor and all our friends witnessing this, and then life happily ever after. And yet, not a lot of thought is often put into what happens afterwards. Men, they don't think about the wedding day at all. Like 0. Honeymoon, quite a bit. Wedding day, not so much. They just don't think about that. Now they think about having a companion who'll be into everything they're into, whether it's their hobbies or their job or their sports. Men just want, their wives to be into them and everything they're into. And, Christian men, if you're a Christian and you're following Jesus and you're thinking about marriage, you're thinking of guilt-free sex. I just said that, yeah. And so, that's just, Christian guys will think that way. Both men and women think of marriage as having someone else who will validate them as a person. I believe a lot of Christians have been shaped by the world's view of marriage, which is essentially pretty self-centered. Like, we believe that life's ultimate goal is my life, my liberty, and my freedom to pursue happiness at any cost. In fact, we've put that in, we've cemented it into our founding documents as a country, and nothing wrong with that founding document, but I think we've taken that line to the nth degree in our culture and pressed it out in radical ways. So we think any relationship must make me happy, and if it doesn't, I'm free to move on. Authors and Bible scholars and counselors Alice Matthews and Gay Hubbard put it this way: the goal of marriage in postmodern thinking becomes then that the satisfaction of the individual's quest for meaning and fulfillment. You know, that's kind of where we're at right now. That our ultimate goal with marriage seems to be, I must be fulfilled and I must find meaning. And since people change and relationships change, and we might not find that meaning in that relationship, we just change relationships. We just change marriage partners and move on, you know. And yet, when we separate from a committed relationship, we're actually losing out on the benefits. We still crave something there's this hole in our soul to not be alone and relationally. You know, so what's become popular now in our culture is to live together, to cohabitate, because we think, well, marriage like restricts my freedom, and so I don't want to do that until I'm absolutely sure. And yet anybody that's ever lived with somebody and cohabitated realizes real quick, you still, even if you don't have a legal contract, you're still losing freedom, right? You don't get to do willy-nilly whatever you want. You're still with another person and have to work those things out. Our culture's kind of messed up right now, trying to figure out how to do relationships and how to do marriage. You know, one of my contentions is we should get back to God's design. Marriage isn't a human construct, but it's a divine one. And what I want us to do over the next 3 weeks is to look at God's blueprint for marriage, what God's blueprint marriage is. We're starting a series called Marriage Made in Heaven. And so, and really the more I studied this, I came up with that title months ago, but the more I've studied it, where we're really going to end up is looking at the marriage made in Eden over the next 3 weeks. Because if you want a marriage made in heaven, then you probably ought to start with the one that was made in Eden. Because that was the one that was by God's design and started off perfect. And so we're going to take a look at how God designed marriage in Eden in hopes that we'll have a marriage made in heaven. Although it's going to be a lot of work as we're going to see. God created marriage, and He designed it to work. And we're going to find some practical help for our marriages in this. But we're going to start with His design first, not with our questions. And that's tough. Now, to prepare this message, I've relied heavily on Genesis. We're going to be looking at passages in Genesis, as well as in a few weeks, Genesis 2 and Ephesians 5. So you can turn to Genesis 2. Genesis is the very first book in the Bible, so turn to Genesis chapter 2. And also, as I was preparing the messages, I studied a lot, a book that I've owned for 14 years and never cracked the cover of until like the last 2 weeks, called Marriage Made in Eden by Alice Matthews and Gay Hubbard. They are Bible scholars. Alice is a Bible professor, and Gay Hubbard lives in Denver and is a counselor. And just a great book. If you want to go really, really deep on these topics, you could take a look at that. Now, you might be here and say, well, why should I listen? Well, I think if you're married, then it's pretty obvious. If you want a marriage the way God designed it, and if you believe that God is good, then He's going to have the best design and something that'll be beneficial for you. Then I would hope you would listen. Perhaps you've been married a long time. Well, I pray this helps, and you have a good marriage. I hope that what I'm about to talk about the next 3 weeks helps you go from just a good marriage to a much better, even a great marriage. If you're single and you think you may get married, well, then I pray you listen. Because I think what I'm going to give you is some foundational stuff that I'm not sure a lot of us talk about enough before we get married, particularly today, but I think all 3 weeks. But particularly today, something that we need to talk about even a lot before we get married. If you're single and you have no plans on getting married, I think still you should listen for a couple reasons. A, you're rubbing shoulders all the time with married folks that talk about their issues, and I pray you get some wisdom that you can pass along. If you're single and you're not planning on getting married, and let's say you're single and you're a parent already, then you should listen. In fact, I would encourage all parents, whether your kids are really, really little or really, really old, then you should listen, because particularly today, I think it's going to have a lot to speak to parents and how they can help their children prepare for marriage. So I think there's something for everybody here, and that you could use. Well, let's start at the beginning. We'll take a look at Genesis, the first book of the Bible. As you're turning to Genesis chapter 2, let me just catch you up to speed. In Genesis chapter 1, we find out that God creates the world. He speaks, creates the world out of nothing. He creates land and sea and animals and plants. And the very last thing he creates is mankind. And I'm just going to put it on the screen for sake of time. Genesis 1, 26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over all the fish in the sea, birds in the sky, and over every living thing." Very first thing, we were created in the image of God. Like every one of us, we've been created in his image. He said, "Let us create mankind in our image." And it's an illusion right away that God is not, he is one being. Whatever God is made up of, he's one. But there's three persons in his oneness, that God exists in eternal community, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so he's one being, you're one being, but you're also one person, right? God's a little different than us. He is one being, but within the one being, there's three people. You say, how's that work? I have no idea. If I could explain it, I'd be God. So, yeah, I don't understand it. But the important thing to know is he's an eternal community. Loving, gracious community for all of eternity. That's God. And so he wants to create mankind in his image. He creates one man, male and female. This is kind of the synopsis view. We'll get the detailed view of how it happens. But he creates some people, and they have God's image in them, which means they have personality. They create, just like God created. Humans are going to get to create, and the very first thing we hear that they get to create is they get to create other human beings at times, But they're going to create much more than that. They're going to create art. They're going to create all kinds of stuff. They're going to create buildings. They're going to build things or crafts. Anything that you create, dinner, that's part of you displaying the image of God. And so that's part of it. You're created in the image of God. And just like God rules, he gives humans dominion to rule too over the fish in the sea. That was the synopsis view, but let's take a look at the detailed view in chapter 2. Take a look at verse 18. God says in verse 18, "The Lord God said, 'It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him.'" We learn then that Adam is the guy's name, and that all these animals come to him, and he begins to name all the animals, and it says that none of the animals were suitable for him. That God knew, just like in the Trinity, there are three people and together they make a whole. He knew that a human by himself couldn't be whole without relationship of some sort. And so he needed somebody that was different than him, but like him also, and the animals didn't count. And so God says, "I'm going to make a helper." Now, lest you think that when God creates Eve, that helper means subordinate at some point, that he's subordinate, or that she's subordinate. Here's the deal. The word helper here, there's like 4 Hebrew words that God could have used for a subordinate helper. But God didn't choose any of those words. He chose a word for helper that means equal, partner, alongside of. In fact, this word helper that God uses here, it's used 19 times in the Old Testament, 15 of which it refers to God. So it can't mean subordinate, because God's not subordinate to anybody, right? So it means equal. God is going to create an equal partner. Now look how this happens God does this. He creates Eve out of Adam's side, and look what the reaction is of Adam in verse 23. "The man said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. So Adam wakes up after God creates Eve, and he goes, whoa, man, or something. I don't know what he did. But he's like, she looks a whole lot better than I do, And he says what he said here in these verses. Now look what it says right after that. That is why man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now it's pretty easy to just run over this verse and go, oh, how quaint, or that's a nice verse just to kind of, share at a wedding, that kind of thing. I think we do ourselves a great disservice in our marriage when we just run over this verse and don't really look at it in detail. In fact, this exact verse is quoted exactly no less than 4 different times in the New Testament. When Jesus and then some early church leaders were teaching about Christian marriage, they taught on this very passage. So take a look at it. It's a blueprint, I think. I think there's a 3-part design for marriage, and we're going to look at one of those parts today. The very first thing he says, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. The first part, I think, of God's blueprint of how he designed marriage, how he made it, is this idea of leaving. Now, this wasn't radical for the women in ancient society, because when they got married, they knew they were leaving their parents' house. Now, ladies, picture this. In ancient society, you left your parents' house, you went to live with your husband, and your husband lived with his parents. So you actually lived in the parent. Now, they'd build a room onto the house or something, but you'd be living with your in-laws. The radical thing about this passage is God is commanding both man and woman to leave and form their own family unit, to make their own household and their own family. It involves physical leaving, but it's much deeper than that. It's emotionally and relationally leaving your parents as the highest influencer in your life. Do we sever the relationship with our parents? Absolutely not. We still honor and love them. But the nature of the relationship changes, because what God is asking on a human level is this, that the highest priority relationally in your life be your spouse. God is saying, if you want to start to build a marriage that is made the way I designed it, then you have to leave your parents and make a new family unit where your spouse becomes the most influential relationship in your life. Biblical scholar Alice Matthews says, we treat this as a throwaway line, yet it has enormous applications for our marriages. How many people do you know that have marital issues? Just think about some marriages. How many people do you know that have marital issues because they haven't emotionally left home? How many people do you know that? It's the reason mother-in-law jokes exist, right? I mean, it's because people sometimes never leave home. It's why wives roll their eyes when they visit their in-laws and their grown husband suddenly becomes a child again, Why is that? Well, it's either because mom and dad have great influence still over their son, or it's because it's just easier to be childish, You don't have any responsibilities, so you go home and dumb down a little bit. Adults have to navigate relationships, have hard conversations, pay bills, be responsible. So sometimes it's just easier to revert back to childhood in the presence of our parents. To leave, when he says a man and woman leaves their father and mother, to leave means that your marriage is the primary relationship and has the primary sway of your life. Not your parents, not your work relationships, not your siblings, not your hobbies, not even your kids, not even ministry. Psychologically, emotionally, and relationally, you have to leave. Now, you might be saying, Joel, I've been married like 20 years. I left a long time ago, Well, I don't know that matters. I've known people that are married 30, 40 years that whatever mom and dad did or whatever mom and dad said or whatever pattern was in their family, they have foisted that onto their spouse still 20, 30, 40 years later. And it causes friction. And God says, no, you're supposed to create your own way. Yes, we take our parents' examples. We take what they've given us that is good, and we can do that. But have you ever noticed that the thing your family did you think is the best way to do it? But the way your spouse's family did it, they think is the best way to do it? Well, who's right? I don't know. You got to create your own path that's best for your family instead of just foisting upon the spouse what you thought was best. Think about this. This causes problems in marriage all the time because we bring our family patterns into our relationship. Let me just give you a simple, practical example. I'll ask this out loud, and you say the answers out loud, and we'll see if they all match. So, when do you open Christmas gifts? Christmas Eve or Christmas Day? How many say Christmas Eve is when you open up gifts? Does anybody open up gifts? Got a few family. Anybody else? Yeah, both days. Even better. How many Christmas? How many turkeys what you have on Thanksgiving Day? Any turkey people? Yeah. But how many say, no, you don't have turkey on Thanksgiving Day. You have ham, or Thanksgiving, on Christmas. You have ham on Christmas Day. How many it's ham and ham only? Some of you are both, you know. Think about our different patterns that we bring into our relationships of when you do what. Are you supposed to have Christmas dinner at noon or at 5? But our family always had, not just simple, silly illustrations, right? But do you understand that, like, a lot of times those family patterns we bring into our relationships cause friction? And those are simple things, but think about even deeper issues that we bring in. Part of God's design for marriage is for each individual to leave their family. Not just physically, but there's an emotional turn and a relational turn where your spouse becomes the most important relationship and influencer in your life. It's an ongoing thing that we're to continue to leave over and over again and point towards our spouse. Well, what are some applications here? Well, first you begin to ask yourself who has more sway over you. Your parents' desire, or your parents' desires and needs, or your spouse's desires and needs. Begin to ask yourself that. Even if your parents are gone, even if they've passed away, I mean, who has the most sway over you? Because I've known people whose parents have been dead for many years, and yet their parents still have sway over them because they try to do everything in their family just like mom and dad did it, instead of carving out their own way with their spouse. Have you carried any baggage or family patterns into your marriage and forced them onto your spouse? Now, if you're a parent, listen up. If you're a parent, let's say you have a great marriage, or let's say you're a single parent right now, but you have children. If you're a parent, you can help in a lot of ways. If you're a parent of a teenager, then one of the ways you help is even in their teenage years, you don't coddle or enable your teenager. You begin to let them be more independent, make more decisions, and have more consequences. Why? Because you want them to rely on you less and less, so that when and if they get married, that they're already somewhat independent of you, and they can begin to focus all their attention on their spouse and begin to work out the relationship there. You want to help them take responsibility. That helps them when they get married, and it helps you too. If your children are already married, then look for any ways you may be pulling them back in. You're going to have to change for their benefit. Let me just speak to adult parents here, parents of adult children who are married. If you equate doing the same thing every year, if you equate that with loyalty and love, then that's going to be awful hard for your children to live out this verse of leaving mom and dad and forging their own way. If love for you is, well, I don't care. We're all here on Thanksgiving. We're all here at this time, and you have to be. If you start your kid's marriage that way, where you just lay down the law and you equate that with love and loyalty, then you're making it awful hard for your children to obey this verse. You're going to have to adapt and change. And one of the things that Christy and I at different times will talk about what we love about our marriage, and we have a list of things that we'll talk through that we really like about our marriage. One of the things is both of our parents, both sets of parents have modeled this well. Like when we got married, it wasn't like hard and fast, you better be here, because if you love me, you'd be here on this day. It was adaptation and changing and because Dan and Jackie have 3 children, and there's then 3, then those kids are married, and then there's all these different families. You got to try to work all that out of when you get together. And then my mom understanding that too, and so they were flexible, and we formed a new family pattern of when we did things. We used to meet always at this time for Christmas or Thanksgiving or Easter, these things, or we used to do things this way, but because we have new families, they gave us space. They gave each family in their their kids, they gave them each space to form their own family patterns and then try to integrate it and make it work. Parents, you can help your kids obey this verse by not forcing your family pattern on them. That doesn't mean you just do away with everything. It means you're going to have to talk through it about what works, what's helpful. You should begin to commit now that when we have new family members join our family, we'll do something new so we can allow our children to leave and form their new family. If not, if we lay down really, really hard and fast rules as parents for our adult children, even as you're beginning to think maybe you have younger children aren't married yet, if we lay down hard and fast rules, then what we are saying is you have to choose your loyalty. Are you going to be loyal to me as your mom or your dad? Or are you going to be loyal to your new family and your spouse? Parents, I know this is no fun, and I haven't gone through it yet, and so I will, and I'll cry, and I'll have heartache, and I'll do all that. I gotcha. But if we do that, then we're not obeying God and not allowing our children to obey God. They're supposed to be able to leave us and swing their emotion and the relationship to make their spouse the primary relationship and the primary, emotionally, the primary person in their life. And we have to help them do that. I would say too, is if you're married, another application is there any hobby? Is there any person? Is there any friendship? Is there any work relationship? I would even go as far to say, because I see parents make this mistake all the time, is even your children, is anybody above your spouse relationally in your life? Now, I get it. There are times where there's abuse and neglect and abandonment, and that's another scenario. So I get that. But I'm talking in a healthy marriage. Like, have you put your kids above your spouse? Have you put work? Have you put a hobby? Have you even put serving the church? I mean, all these things. Like, what God is saying is the primary relationship in our life, besides God, the primary human relationship is our spouse. That's this first part of leaving. Well, I'd originally planned to get through all 3 parts of God's blueprint for marriage that was made in Eden. But I think I've probably given you enough to chew on. And so over the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at the next two parts. The being united to our spouse and then becoming one flesh. So we'll look at those the next 2 weeks. Blueprints are tricky things when we talk about blueprints. When some of our folks last year, Gary and some of his workers, Gary, you see, was finishing the prayer room just off here to this door here. When we were doing the plans for it, we realized that the plumbing plans didn't match what was actually physically happening back there. And it was because in the course of construction here that the plumber had to make some changes based on the way things were in real life and not on paper. But we didn't have that paper, and so it was confusing. So we had to call the original plumber, and he brought his set. Now his set at the base looked the same as ours, but his had a bunch of writing and marks on it with new water lines and new places and things they did do and things they didn't do. And so we had to get that picture so they would line up. When we were framing the offices, we did the sweat equity to frame the offices. As we were framing and begin to measure and lay the offices out over here, we realized that the structural engineer's blueprint of all the steel beams that hold the place up didn't match the framing schematic, blueprint exactly. If we'd have built it like it was designed or like it was on the blueprints, if we tried to make both blueprints work, well, then there would have been a steel post right in the middle of the hallway of the offices. And you usually don't have a steel post right in the middle of the hallway. And so we had to shift everything over a little bit to capture that post. It's important, if multiple people are working on the same project, it's important that both have the same set of blueprints. Here's one reason I think we struggle sometimes in our marriages. And whether you're not married yet and you're preparing later in life to be married or you're already married, here's one reason we struggle. That as husbands and wives, we carry in two separate blueprints. And there's just a ton of conflict, isn't there, when you're operating off two separate sets of blueprints. My challenge to us over the next few weeks is to begin to look at God's blueprint and make that the blueprint for our relationships. Dennis Rainey of Family Life Today says, many times I've used the illustration of a husband having a set of blueprints and his wife having a set of blueprints. And the problem is their blueprints only overlap at certain points. If a husband and wife are both to get the same set of blueprints and they're both coming at their marriage relationship from Scripture, they're going to be building their marriage as God has designed it. Whether you're single thinking about getting married, or a single person who ends up giving advice to friends about marriage, or whether you're a parent whose child will get married or they're already married, or whether you're a married couple sitting in this room doing well or in crisis, let me just challenge us. Let's just surrender our blueprints, the ones we've made up, the ones the world has given us, even the ones our parents have given us. We want to keep the good examples in our parents' life, obviously, but we want to give up the ones our culture have given us. And let's commit to doing married life according to God's blueprint. The first step according to God is to leave our parents and to make our spouse the primary commitment in our life relationally. Just close today by asking the Holy Spirit to come. If you're new to the Vineyard, what we do is when we wrap up our teaching time, we give space for God to speak. So let's just do that. Let's hold out our lives to God right now. Right now.